White teenagers buried an elderly black woman alive. What happened next will shock you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Stories of Life's Acts channel. And before we continue this story, let us know where you are from. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe as we release videos every day at 12:30 p.m. Ruth was an elderly woman who lived alone in a small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Her house wasn't large, but it was very cozy and simple. Ruth was of African descent and had spent her entire life in the United States, experiencing many ups and downs, yet she always maintained a kind heart and a strong spirit. Although she was elderly and in poor health, Ruth always tried to take care of herself. Every morning, she would wake up early and do simple household chores like sweeping the yard and taking care of the plants. She enjoyed the peaceful mornings, sitting outside with a cup of tea, watching the birds fly by. Despite living alone, Ruth did not feel lonely. She had a few friends in the neighborhood, especially the neighbors, who often visited her and chatted. She always welcomed anyone into her home, whether they were friends or strangers. Her stories about the past, her family, and the hardships she had endured helped her build close relationships with everyone. Ruth had a warm heart and was always ready to help those around her. Whenever someone was in trouble, she did not hesitate to spend time listening and sharing her life experiences. Although her life lacked many luxuries, she always felt content because she lived in a community where she felt safe and loved. However, not everything in her life was always smooth. She had gone through great losses, especially when her husband passed away many years ago. Although she was saddened by the loss, she continued to live with the belief that every day was a precious gift, and she found ways to enjoy each moment of life. As the days went by, Ruth gradually became an indispensable part of the neighborhood. People loved her for her gentleness, sincerity, and the way she treated everyone, whether they were family or strangers. However, no one knew that in the coming days, Ruth would have to face a horrific challenge she never could have imagined. In the neighborhood where Ruth lived, there was a group of white teenagers. This group often gathered together, not focusing on their studies, and had a habit of causing trouble. They didn't care about moral values or respecting others. Instead, they spent most of their time playing around, frequently engaging in strange and not so positive behaviors. Even though they lived in a quiet neighborhood, they did not integrate with the community and even looked down on the elderly or people of different races. Within this group of teenagers, some were high school students, while others had dropped out of school long ago. They had not found a direction in life and often caused disturbances in the neighborhood. Some of them frequently played pranks, from throwing stones at windows to messing with animals. They didn't feel guilty about their actions, and there was no one in their families or the community to remind them of their wrongdoings. The group of teenagers usually gathered at night, and each time they became louder. They would often laugh and joke noisily, and sometimes they even went to houses in the neighborhood and harassed the residents. Although they knew their actions could disturb others, the group of teenagers continued without any remorse. Some people in the neighborhood began to feel concerned about the actions of this group. They didn't know if the group's recklessness and disrespect might lead to more serious incidents. However, they still hoped that these teenagers would change and that their actions would not escalate. Older residents, like Ruth, always tried to keep their distance from the group, feeling that they could not communicate with these young people. They realized that the group lacked proper education and did not appreciate the human values in life. But in Ruth's heart, she still hoped that one day they would realize their mistakes and mature. However, no one in the neighborhood could have imagined that one day these teenagers would carry out a cruel and horrific act, something that no one could have predicted. And it would be Ruth, whom they always viewed as weak and vulnerable, who would become the victim of this act. One evening, during the weekend, when the sun had just set behind the tall buildings, this group of teenagers gathered at a park near Ruth's house. The atmosphere in the park was very calm, with only a few people walking and children playing. However, this group of teenagers did not have any interest in doing anything wholesome. They had no intention of heading home. Instead, they sought out mischief-activities that might make others feel scared or uncomfortable. They began talking about silly things, and then a crazy idea popped into their heads. One of the boys in the group, named Jake, suddenly proposed a game that he thought would be interesting. Jake said, "Why don't we challenge an old lady in the neighborhood? Let us do something she will never forget." The others laughed loudly, and none of them realized that this action would have serious consequences. They remembered Ruth, the elderly woman who lived alone nearby. Although Ruth was always friendly and kind to everyone, this group of teenagers did not care about that. They saw her only as an object for their teasing, a way to challenge themselves and feel more powerful than the vulnerable. With this idea in mind, the teenagers immediately left the park and headed toward Ruth's small house. As they got closer, Ruth was walking alone on the sidewalk, as usual. She was heading home after a peaceful evening, unaware that her life was about to be completely turned upside down. Ruth recognized this group of teenagers from a distance, but she did not think they would do anything harmful to her. She always thought of them as mischievous kids, but never imagined they would do something frightening. As the teenagers approached, they started laughing and teasing her. At first, Ruth felt a little uncomfortable, but she still tried to smile and greet them, thinking it was just harmless fun. However, just as Ruth walked past them, one of the teenagers suddenly rushed forward and pulled her toward a car parked nearby. Ruth was terrified, trying to scream for help, but the group quickly tied her up. They did not stop there. They also threatened her and ordered her to remain silent. Ruth couldn't understand what was happening. She had lived in this neighborhood for so many years, always helping others and treating everyone kindly. Yet now, she was being kidnapped by this group of teenagers, and they had no intention of letting her go. She felt dizzy and afraid, not knowing what would happen next. The teenagers felt no guilt or remorse. They laughed and thought they were just playing a game. They didn't realize they were committing a crime, an act that could change their lives forever. To them, Ruth was just an easy target to satisfy their mischief and sense of power. Although Ruth couldn't do anything to fight back against the teenagers, she still held on to the hope that someone would come to her rescue, or at least someone would recognize the wrongness of their actions. But as the group began to take her to a secluded area where no one could see or hear her cries for help, that hope seemed to fade away. After kidnapping Ruth, the group of teenagers took her to an empty, desolate plot of land on the outskirts of the city. It was a remote area, rarely visited by anyone, and that night was even quieter than usual. There was no one nearby, only the gentle sound of the wind and clouds drifting across the sky. Ruth felt a deep sense of fear, not understanding why these teenagers were doing this to her. She tried to ask them what their purpose was, but they remained silent and did not answer. Though she didn't fully understand what was going on, she felt a growing sense of worry and unease. One of the teenagers in the group, named Jake, started signaling to the others. They tied her hands with a rope, but without causing her injury. Ruth couldn't comprehend why they were treating her like this when she had always lived peacefully and helped others. She tried to reassure herself, hoping that their actions were just a prank and that they would release her after having their fun. The teenagers started laughing and joking, and some of them thought they were simply playing with her. They didn't realize that their actions were crossing a line. After tying her up, they just left her sitting there for a while, not doing anything else. It seemed they just wanted to make her feel scared. Ruth felt very tired, and the fear still clung to her. Although she did not know what these teenagers intended to do next, she tried to stay calm. In her heart, she prayed that someone would come to rescue her before things went too far. After a while, the group of teenagers began to realize that their actions might have gone too far. They stopped their bad behavior and simply stood quietly, looking at each other. Ruth didn't know what to do, but she sensed a small shift in the teenagers' attitudes. Eventually, the teenagers decided to release her and walked away without saying another word. Ruth sat there for a moment, feeling confused and scared. But she wasn't seriously injured, and she quickly stood up, trying to walk back home, hoping that this was just a nightmare. She couldn't understand why these teenagers had acted this way. However, she still held on to the belief that not everyone is evil, and that one day they would realize their wrongdoings. After the incident, Ruth felt disoriented and anxious. Although she had been released, the fear still lingered in her mind. She couldn't understand why the teenagers had behaved this way, but she knew she needed to do something to protect herself and the community. The event had made it impossible for her to live in peace as she had before. Ruth decided not to stay silent about what had happened. She went to speak with a few neighbors and shared the incident. The neighbors, who had always liked her, were shocked and worried. They couldn't imagine that the group of teenagers who had lived in the neighborhood for years could act so ruthlessly. Some people in the neighborhood started making plans to report the incident to the police, but Ruth did not want to make a big fuss. She feared that if the matter was exposed, the teenagers might become even more violent. However, even though Ruth did not want to escalate the situation, word about the incident spread throughout the neighborhood. The neighbors began to worry about their safety and the safety of their families. They didn't know if the teenagers would continue to cause trouble, and they no longer wanted to live in fear. Some people decided to discuss the matter with the parents of those teenagers to find a way to address the issue. Ruth also felt a sense of responsibility toward the children in the neighborhood. Despite being treated terribly, she did not want the young people to grow up with such negative attitudes and disrespect. She thought that if she could, she would try to teach these teenagers a lesson about kindness and respecting others. She hoped they would change and never hurt anyone again. A few days later, the group of teenagers began to realize that their actions could lead to serious consequences. They felt ashamed because their behavior had caused fear and confusion throughout the neighborhood. A few of them began to regret their actions and felt guilty toward Ruth. They didn't know what to do to apologize to her, but they felt the need to face their mistakes. One evening, one of the teenagers in the group, named Tyler, decided to visit Ruth. He wanted to apologize for what had happened and hoped she would forgive him. When he arrived at Ruth's door, he felt very nervous and did not know what to say. He had prepared some words of apology, but he wasn't sure if she even wanted to hear them. When Ruth opened the door, Tyler saw the worry and fatigue in her eyes. However, she was not angry, but instead looked at him calmly. Tyler hesitated, then said, "Mrs. Ruth, I am sorry. We were wrong, and I feel very regretful. I didn't think things would go this far. I am truly sorry." The sincerity in the teenager's words made Ruth feel somewhat relieved. She didn't want this incident to haunt her, and she knew that forgiveness could help both her and the group of teenagers move past their pain. Ruth looked at Tyler and said, "Thank you for coming here and apologizing. Everyone can make mistakes, but what matters is recognizing them and making things right. You can change and become a better person." Tyler felt a sense of relief in his heart, though he knew Ruth still needed time to fully forgive him. However, this incident did not just affect the teenagers and Ruth. It also made the community in the neighborhood reconsider the issues of education and caring for one another. Parents began to pay more attention to their children, not only teaching them proper behavior, but also emphasizing respect for others and never letting anger lead to wrongful actions. So, although the initial event brought fear and pain, it also became a great lesson for everyone in the neighborhood. People understood that more needed to be done to protect the good values within the community, and that forgiveness, if possible, could help heal wounds. After being released, Ruth felt exhausted, tired, and still haunted by what had just happened. Although she wasn't seriously injured, what she had gone through left her with indescribable anxiety. She couldn't understand why the teenagers had acted that way, especially when she had always treated them and others around her kindly. When she returned home, Ruth sat down in a chair in the living room, running her hand over her skin as if to comfort herself. But no matter what she did, the anxiety would not leave her. She began to think about the teenagers' actions. They seemed to just want to play around, but somewhere deep inside her, she felt that this was not as simple as it appeared. She felt that they had crossed a line, and if nothing changed, they would continue to hurt others. While she sat there, reflecting on what had happened, a cold breeze suddenly blew through the window, snapping her out of her thoughts. She knew she couldn't let fear control her life. Ruth had lived through many hardships in her life, and she could not let a group of teenagers make her feel weak. The feeling of unease gradually gave way to resilience and determination. She decided that she could not remain silent about this any longer. Ruth began thinking about her next course of action. She didn't want to cause more trouble, but she also couldn't let those teenagers continue their behavior. She knew that without the community's intervention, this situation would never change. She started talking to a few trusted neighbors about what had happened. These people were shocked and worried when they heard her story. Everyone felt that this could not be tolerated in such a community. A few neighbors suggested that she report it to the police, but Ruth did not want to make a big issue out of it. She knew the police could help, but she also feared the teenagers might feel offended and cause more trouble. However, she also realized that if she did not act, this incident could continue to affect others. Ruth decided to take a different approach. She thought that instead of criticizing and condemning the teenagers, perhaps she should find a way to help them realize their mistake and change. She thought that they were just misguided kids, lacking understanding and proper guidance. But if someone could show them the consequences of their wrong actions, maybe they would change. A few days later, Ruth decided to meet with the group of teenagers directly. She didn't come to punish or condemn them, but to talk and help them understand how she had felt during the entire incident. One afternoon, she visited one of the teenagers in the group, named Jake. He had been the leader in tying her up, and she felt he might be the one who could understand and listen the most. When Ruth arrived at Jake's house, he seemed very surprised and anxious. Ruth started with a simple sentence. "Jake, I want to talk to you for a moment." Although Jake felt ashamed, he still listened to her. Ruth shared her feelings about being kidnapped and tied up, explaining how scared and pained she had been. She didn't blame Jake or the others in the group, but she wanted them to understand that their actions could hurt others. As Ruth spoke, Jake's face gradually became more serious. He hadn't realized that his actions would have such significant consequences. He felt guilty and began to regret participating in what had happened. After a moment of silence, Jake finally admitted, "I'm truly sorry, Ruth. We did not think you would feel that way. We thought it was just a prank, but now I understand we were wrong." Ruth smiled gently. "Thank you for understanding. Everyone can make mistakes, but the important thing is to recognize the mistake and correct it. I hope you will never do this to anyone again." This conversation didn't just change Jake, it also impacted the other teenagers in the group. They started to realize that their actions were not harmless pranks, but could truly hurt others. A few of them sought Ruth out to apologize and express their regret. Ruth felt relieved, but she knew that this small step was not enough to change everything. She continued to work with the community to help the teenagers and teach them the values of respect and compassion. She believed that although things could not change immediately, if everyone worked together and understood each other better, society would improve. After the conversations and apologies, Ruth felt somewhat relieved, but she knew that the process of change would take time. The teenagers in the group had not only learned about the wrongness of their actions, but also felt the power of forgiveness. Although they couldn't undo the past, Ruth believed that opening their hearts and forgiving could help them grow and mature. The community in the neighborhood also began to change. The neighbors, who had been fearful after the incident, gradually regained their trust. They started organizing meetings, sharing and discussing ways to build a more united and understanding community. Ruth participated in these conversations, not as a victim, but as an inspiration for forgiveness and love. Parents in the neighborhood began to pay more attention to educating their children, not only about moral values, but also about how to respect and protect each other. They understood that care, love, and open communication were the keys to preventing negative actions. Sometime later, Ruth met with the group of teenagers again. This time, they came to her not to apologize, but to share the changes in their lives. Jake, who had previously apologized to her, had now become a role model for the others in the group. He began participating in community activities, helping those in need. The other teenagers gradually changed as well, becoming more responsible individuals. Ruth saw these changes and felt overjoyed. Although the initial incident caused a lot of pain and confusion, she realized that painful experiences could become a source of motivation to help others grow and change. She felt happy to see her community becoming more united and better over time. In the end, Ruth understood that forgiveness is not only an act that frees others, but also frees oneself. She no longer felt afraid or anxious about what had happened. She knew that life went on, and each day was an opportunity to do better, to build better relationships with others. Ruth's story was not only the story of a woman facing fear, but also a story of forgiveness, change, and hope. She believed that even though the world might be full of challenges and difficulties, as long as each of us could reflect on our actions and learn from our mistakes, we could create a better world. Ruth's story and the story of the group of teenagers had come to an end, but the lessons from it would last forever. We may not be able to change the past, but we can change the present and the future. Small acts of forgiveness and respect can create big changes, and that is what Ruth wanted to share with the world. Thank you all for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on the best stories. See you in the next one.